we have a variety of experiences, and we all can relate to these stories. Now our next question is from the conference center once again.
Hi, I am Carolyn Brick from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And my question relates to those 5 or so genres that you've spoken of ASL literature, such as poetry. Excuse me for going back in time with my question, but you talked about the features in ASL poetry, such as rhythm and rhyme. You know, in English poetry, or spoken language poetry, they have various forms of poetry. Sometimes their poetry doesn't rhyme, it doesn't have rhythm. I'm wondering if within ASL poetry there could also be this same type of difference. If you could have a poem without rhythm or rhyme, but that's just more emotional. Something that shows the person's experience. Because somebody sharing their experience can be a poem in itself. The one poem we saw with the girl sit and smile, where finally at the end she got up and left. My sister-in-law, my husband and I often experience that in our life, and that's an emotional issue. So is that poetry?
The answer to your question. We talked about the 5 features generally. I guess what Jane had recapped those for us. We were talking about poetic features, not genres, but specifically, you know, could you just have, quote-unquote, emotion only be poetry, just having poetry by emotion? Well, it's kind of like looking at E.E. Cummings' poetry, an English poet. You know, he used, in one case, he just used punctuation, and it was considered poetry. So I think that's a motto we can look at. Poetry itself, you know, again, we have this licensing mechanism that allows you to experiment with the forms of the language. You know, maybe a poem could just be this. That would be it. Is that a poem? Who knows?
Tying into those comments, we're not going to put anybody into a box as to what poetry is and what it isn't in ASL. Some people claim that what they do is poetry, and if the public recognizes it, then you know that increases the view of what poetry is. You know, just because an individual claims that they're doing a poem, you know, will depend rather if it's accepted or not. And once the community accepts it, then it's recognized as a form of poetry. So there's that balance too.
Well, I guess I believe that's where the field is headed, especially with literary critics. I think some work needs to be done in this area. I guess I'm uncomfortable to say this poem or this is a story or this emotion is clearly portrayed. I don't think we have a clear definition of what a poem is. I've seen a videotape for sale that says, you know, they're going to depict different ASL poems. And I just have to wonder sometimes if it's just not a good story. I think that's something we need to really take a look at and determine more clearly what are the poetics of ASL and find some more commonality. That way we could come up with a better definition of what poetry in ASL really means.
We could go on with this, trying to explain the parameters of ASL poetry. Again, it is a new art form. New really isn't a good word, but it has only gained recognition recently. And at this point, we're not sure if poetry may be the correct term, but I don't want to open that can of worms. We have another question from Lori Wiedemann in Cincinnati, Ohio. These ideas seem appropriate for children who are in schools for the deaf or deaf classrooms. Is there any way to incorporate these ideas for an interpreter with a mainstream student?
Don't look at me. I don't know. Oh.
Well, let me see if I can attempt a beginning of the answer, and maybe Ben or someone else can complete the answer. Let's see, an interpreter's job is, defined as facilitating communication within the classroom. You really don't have control over what's occurring in the classroom. The teachers develop the lesson plans, they follow curriculum sequence. They may be working with English poetry, and then trying to convert that into an ASL poetry form is a little more difficult. So it's really English poetry in a manual form. That's pretty much what it is. So when you talk about in a mainstream setting, unless everyone within that hearing classroom is working on a unit, say, on ASL poetry or ABC stories, well, sure, then the interpreter would be able to work through with that. But I'm not sure how else to see it.
I think also, I don't necessarily want to address the issue of interpreters. I think that's a separate one. But deaf children in mainstream schools, well, I believe that the schools should really seek out and try to incorporate ASL literature into those classrooms, again, by inviting deaf adults, so that the children are exposed to this kind of ASL literature. And they'll be able to see that in many different ways. I think it's important for all deaf children. I believe all schools have the ability to really incorporate that. The resources are there. And I think it's important that schools do this for the children's sake.
Okay. I have to admit, that question is really impossible to answer. It would take another whole program. Jane, maybe you need to sponsor a program on that topic. I do not, of course, mean to make light of it, but it is quite a loaded question. Again, we discussed resources and the fact that there aren't enough resources or programs available. Our next question is a fax question sent in by Dave Bowman from Pitt College in Granville, North Carolina. His question is, the majority of deaf children have hearing parents. What are some pragmatic suggestions that you have to bring deaf students towards English literacy?
Well, practical guides are probably difficult. I think you really need to have good practitioners. I mean, a person who's actually skilled in a language is going to help. And if the person's not skilled in the language, you're forced to look for resources elsewhere. And that's a lot more difficult. I mean, there are resources, as we said, some out there, but I think it's really important. It's kind of, there's a cycle that goes along with this. If you don't have the resources, if the person's not a practitioner, it's difficult. Lon, do you want to add on to that?
Yes, Ben, you mentioned resources outside of the classroom. That might be something that the schools are not doing enough. They're pretty much looking at internal resources and not really thinking about going outside the school. That might be a problem in and of itself. One, of course, of the richest resources is that deaf community right there in their community. They need to make contact and develop relationships with the resources within the deaf community. Maybe tap into that. I don't think the schools are doing enough of it. There's a model of this going on in the Bay Area in California. It's called Deaf Media. They encourage the arts and educational networking there. And the program is called DEAN. And that program develops a list of the individuals within the community who have skill in storytelling and so forth, and then they let the schools know that this is available. And so that when they need a storyteller, they contact Dean. Dean finds someone on the list available and passes it on. Of course, that works very well. There's a model there that I think that actually the nation should be looking at to see what they're doing and perhaps expand that idea as a way of utilizing resources within the community.
Again, it's a shared effort. It requires community involvement. We have another question from someone in our studio audience.
Hello, My name is Carlos Budding, and I work in Fairfax, Virginia. I'm just wondering, some people have said that literature really applies to a written language or a written form of a language. So my question is, how do you support the idea of an ASL literature when there is no written form?
Well, in the beginning of the teleclass, I did explain that if we look at literature, a strict definition of literature perhaps might talk only about the written form of language. But many people who have analyzed literature from a variety of perspectives have looked at literature, again, coming in two basic forms: the written form and the spoken or the live form. And that's where we have a whole field that looks at the oral tradition of literature, that has studied the oral tradition and the passing down of stories through live language, and mostly through spoken language, non-written forms of languages. So ASL definitely fits into that framework. So again, when we think of literature, we are not limiting our definition to a written form, and that's a debate that's gone out in the field, and I think it's an open question.
I wanted to add, I see a parallel between linguistics and literature. I think in the field of linguistics, years ago, people believed that language was solely those that were based on some kind of auditory form. But as they began to investigate, they found that American Sign Language is a language that does not incorporate the auditory mode, but instead a visual mode, and languages can do this. I think if we looked very closely at literature and have an in-depth study, we could see that there is an impact there. We would find that the study of American Sign Language literature would really change what we view it as right now. It doesn't necessarily require the use of any kind of written or read form. It can come in the form of a visual or oral form. So I think that we really need to study this area and challenge what establishments actually have as far as their view of what literature is. And I think we can see a difference between linguistics and literature.
Again, in terms of definition, we talk about the oral tradition, and we have the orators and the people who actually use this language. Again, when we look at when we talk about literature, we talk about oralature. Again, we've kind of taken that at the end of the morpheme and talked about the study of the oral narrative. Again, literature being kind of a category whereby the forms can be either written or manual or live language.
We have so many questions. We've come to the end of our questions. This is Marla Hattrack. I've known her for many years. Marla, what is your question?
Yes, hi, I'm Marla Hattrick, and I'm with a company, Dawn Sign Press, who publishes ASL poetry and videos and a literature series by Dr. Ben Bain. One common issue that we face with production is insufficient number of trained teachers available for the production videos. I'm wondering, are there any plans for training more individuals, more people who can then produce these themselves?
Well, I'm not aware of any formal plans currently, but I definitely agree with you. We certainly need to provide more training for individuals, for teachers, so that they can better understand what American Sign Language literature is. It'd be wonderful to provide this kind of training so that teachers as well as parents could then utilize videotapes at home, and they would be able to help their children through that. So I agree, definitely, training is much needed. But I don't know of any plans myself. Are you aware of any, Ben or Lon?
Plans would indicate that everything's ready to go, but I have heard people talking about it, discussing and recognizing the need for it. I think this is just a matter of time before you see the talk translated into action, and I hope it happens real soon.
Our time is just about up. Time always goes fast when you're having fun. Boy, we could stay here all night discussing these various topics. But I want to remind you that you're going to have a chance to send in your questions. And could we basically have each of you do a 30-second wrap-up, give us some advice before we close? Ben?
Well, I basically say, come on down. I mean, I want people in a variety of areas to really, really use their storytelling skills and really take advantage of the local resources you have. Videotape people telling stories about their experiences. Collect stories from your local deaf community. I think that would be a great way to start that. And we can't forget, multicultural groups. For example, this morning at the conference, Melanie McKay Cody, who is the keynote speaker, talked about Native Americans. And talked about, the rich tradition there, that there are deaf people there, and there are, in the Plains Indians, for example, the Plains Indian Sign Language, there are plenty of stories there that are out there that are, ripe for the picking that we haven't done. So I think it's really important to collect the local literature that we have. And I think that way it's a great resource that we could all use.
I would like to put forth the challenge that we do more partnerships between universities and schools. I think that collaboration is very essential. We have the theory of literature and the analysis of the different genres of literature that we find in the universities, and that information can help schools develop curriculum. And that way, those collaborative efforts between universities and school can be beneficial. And related to that last question, we would like to develop some plans, or I'd like to see the development of some plans for training in this area.
All right, I'd like to point out that right now there are deaf people out there who are poets, are ABC storytellers and narrative storytellers. And we need to stop and think. When they were growing up, did they have the benefit of coursework and classroom work in terms of ASL literature? Was there an ASL literature curriculum? There was nothing like that, but yet this art form developed, emerged, and continued, and we're thankful for it. Now, right now, I'm even more excited because we've been discussing the need for establishing an ASL literature curriculum, and if this actually gets going and really happens, then our students are going to be learning the mechanics of all this, something that our past generations have not had that benefit. So I think the future in the field of ASL literature, to me, is very exciting. And I think we ought to be very excited what these aspects are going to be carrying forth for us.
Thank you so much. Basically, we've just begun. We've just scratched the surface as to what is out there. This is just a beginning. I want to thank you, Ben, Jane, and Lon, for your involvement today. It was fascinating. I'm sure you viewers have learned a lot, and so have I. I'd like to thank our deaf storytellers, whose work is an inspiration to us, and our children who deserve the opportunity to expand their creative skills using the most accessible language, ASL. You people are the ones who can make it happen. And thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If we didn't fit your own question in, keep an eye for our website. We'll show it to you here at the bottom of our screen. Here it is. We'll try to post the answers to your questions early this summer. I'm pleased to inform you as well, you can order a VHS copy of the materials of this conference as well as our previous ones. To order your copy, you can call, fax, write, or email to the Gallaudet University Distance Education Program in the College for Continuing Education. We'll add your name to the mailing list for future Gallaudet satellite teleconference programs. Watch for the web for more announcements about next season's teleconference broadcasts from Gallaudet. From all of us here in Washington, D.C., thanks for joining us. I'm Bob Daniels. Bye-bye.